For 3 years, the Alpha King had not spoken a single word. He sat upon his iron throne, a terrifying mountain of dark steel. Below him, defeated men begged for mercy on the freezing floor, silenced by a single flick of his scarred fingers. The great hall suffocated in absolute terror. Then, a heavy door creaked open. The trembling nobles parted. A tiny, barefoot, 7-year-old girl stepped into the cavernous room, shivering beneath a frayed blanket. Ignoring the drawn swords, she climbed the stone steps to the throne. She didn't see a ruthless warlord. She simply held out a half-eaten piece of stale bread. The deadliest man alive stared at her small hand, and his silence finally broke. King Chris sat on the iron throne. He had not spoken a single word in 3 years. The silence began on the day they placed the heavy crown on his head. War had taken his family, leaving him with a fractured kingdom and a hollow chest. Now, he ruled through sharp hand gestures and cold stares. His silence had become a weapon sharper than any sword in the armory. Men feared his quiet judgment more than a shouted execution order. Winter wind battered the high windows of the great hall. Braziers burned along the stone walls, but the air remained freezing. Dozens of lords stood rigidly before the dais. They whispered to one another, their eyes nervously darting toward the throne. A scribe read from a long parchment. He stammered over the dates, terrified of making a mistake. Chris rested his chin on his scarred fist. He watched the assembly with tired, heavy eyes. The endless petitions meant nothing to him today. The nobles argued over grain taxes and minor border disputes. None of them understood the true cost of the peace they enjoyed. They wore thick furs and velvet cloaks to ward off the chill. Chris wore simple dark leather and unpolished steel. He did not need the trappings of wealth to command the room. His presence alone suffocated the space. The scribe finally finished reading and stepped back. He waited for a nod or a dismissal from the throne. Chris simply blinked, offering no reaction. The heavy wooden doors at the far end of the hall suddenly swung open. A violent draft rushed in and extinguished the nearest torches. Captain Miller stepped forward, his boots ringing loudly on the flagstones. He bowed stiffly before the silent ruler. "My lord, the refugees from the northern villages have arrived," Miller announced. Chris slowly lowered his fist from his jaw. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The guards parted, creating a narrow path down the center aisle. A stream of shivering people shuffled into the vast hall. They were victims of the recent border skirmishes and the brutal frost. Men and women clutched their meager belongings in ragged sacks. They kept their heads bowed, terrified of the silent man on the throne. The wealthy lords wrinkled their noses and instinctively stepped back. They did not want the dirt of the road touching their fine clothes. Chris studied the broken people with a blank expression. He recognized the raw hunger in their sunken cheeks. It was the same look his soldiers had worn during the siege of Oakhaven. The hall grew restless as more refugees filed inside. The guards formed a tight perimeter to keep them away from the nobility. Among the shifting crowd, a small figure suddenly broke away from the group. It was a young girl, no older than 6. Her name was Chloe. She wore a ragged wool coat that swallowed her small frame. Her boots were wrapped in dirty cloth straps to keep out the deep snow. She did not look down at the floor like the others. Instead, she stared directly at the front of the room. Chloe began to walk straight up the center aisle. Her footsteps made soft, muffled sounds on the cold stone. She moved with an odd sense of purpose. The hall quickly grew dead silent. Even the whispering lords stopped talking and stared. A woman in the refugee crowd gasped and reached out blindly. She missed Chloe's sleeve by a fraction of an inch. The girl just kept walking forward. She bypassed the wealthy merchants without a glance. She walked past the hardened soldiers and their polished weapons. She did not seem to notice the spears or the chainmail. She only saw the man sitting at the end of the room. Captain Miller stepped out of line to intercept her. "Halt right there," he commanded in a low, warning voice. He reached down to grab her thin shoulder. Before his heavy glove could touch her, Chris leaned forward. The iron legs of his chair scraped sharply against the stone dais. The harsh sound echoed through the entire cavernous hall. Miller froze instantly and yanked his hand back. He looked up at the throne in sudden panic. Chris slowly raised his right index finger. It was a clear, undeniable command to stand down. Miller stepped aside, his face turning pale. He lowered his head and refused to make eye contact with anyone. Chloe continued her steady march until she reached the base of the dais. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. Chris looked down at her. His face remained an unreadable mask. She looked back up at him. Her face was smudged with dark soot and dry dirt. Her nose was bright red from the bitter cold. She clutched something tightly in her right hand against her chest. Slowly, she lifted her foot and climbed the first stone step. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. No one approached the king uninvited. Even his closest generals kept a respectful distance from the dais. She climbed the second step. Chris did not move a muscle. He watched her small boots slip slightly on the smooth, polished stone. She steadied herself and kept going. She reached the top of the dais. Now she stood only an arm's length away from him. The silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush bone. The guards held their breath, waiting for the king to react. The lords watched in stunned disbelief. Chloe uncurled her freezing, dreck-stained fingers. She held out a small, badly bruised apple. It was half frozen and entirely unimpressive. It was likely the only food she had found in days. She pushed her hand closer to him. "You look hungry," Chloe said. Her voice was clear and steady in the vast, quiet room. It did not shake with fear. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him without trembling in 3 years. Chris stared at the small apple resting in her palm. He did not look at the guards. He did not look at the furious nobles. He slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers, LCs of his past. Now, a starving child had breached those walls with a single worthless piece of bread. He looked back at the large bed. Chloe was breathing deeply and evenly. Her small face looked remarkably peaceful in the flickering firelight. Chris stood up and walked back to the heavy door. He opened it to find 2 guards standing at rigid attention in the hallway. "Bring hot water," he ordered. He kept his voice low so he would not disturb her rest. "And fetch the kitchen maid to bring a bowl of warm broth." The guards nodded and hurried off to fulfill the commands. Chris closed the door and returned to his wooden chair. He pulled the stale bread from his pocket. He turned it over in his large, scarred hands. It was practically inedible. Yet, it felt like the most valuable thing he had received since taking the throne. He placed the bread carefully on the small table next to his chair. He vowed silently that the girl would never go hungry again. He leaned back and closed his tired eyes. The silence in the room felt different now. It was no longer heavy and suffocating. It felt strangely peaceful. A soft knock sounded at the door a few minutes later. A young maid entered, carrying a steaming bowl of chicken broth on a silver tray. She looked terrified to be inside the king's private chambers. Chris pointed to the small table next to the bed. The maid set the tray down with shaking hands. She bowed quickly and practically ran out of the room. Chris walked over to the bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress. The bed vexed slightly under his considerable weight. He gently shook Chloe's shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked confused for a moment as she took in her new surroundings. She saw Chris sitting right beside her. She sat up quickly, clutching the heavy cloak to her chin. Chris picked up the bowl of broth. He held it out to her. "Eat." His voice was still rough, but it lacked its usual harsh edge. Chloe stared at the steaming bowl. She reached out tentatively and took it with both hands. The warmth of the bowl seeped directly into her cold fingers. She brought the rum to her lips and took a small, careful sip. Her eyes widened in surprise. She began to drink the broth eagerly. Chris watched her with a quiet, patient intensity. He waited until she had finished every last drop. She lowered it to bowl and let out a long, satisfied sigh. She looked up at him. "Thank you." Her voice was tiny and frail, sounding like a bird's chirp. Chris took the empty bowl from her hands. "What is your name?" He asked the question slowly, ensuring he did not startle her. Chloe pulled her knees to her chest. "Chloe." Chris nodded once. "I am Chris." He did not introduce himself as the king. He did not use any of his terrifying military titles. Chloe tilted her head and studied his scarred face again. "You were sad down there." She pointed vaguely in the direction of the great hall. Chris did not try to deny it. He simply looked at the fire burning steadily in the hearth. "I have been cold for a very long time, Chloe." He surprised himself with the honest admission. Chloe reached out from beneath the thick fur of his cloak. She placed her small hand over his large, calloused one. "The fire is warm." Chris looked down at their joined hands. The physical contrast between them was stark and undeniable. He squeezed her fingers gently. "Yes, it is." Morning light broke through the high, arched windows. Chloe woke up surrounded by soft linen and thick wool. She sat up and wiped her sleepy eyes. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Chris was already awake. He sat at a heavy wooden desk in the corner of the room. Several maps and parchment scrolls were spread out before him. He did not wear his heavy armor today. He wore a simple dark tunic that stretched across his broad shoulders. He heard the rustle of the bedsheets and looked up. "Good morning." His voice was still rough, but the quiet room softened the sound. Chloe pushed the heavy furs aside and swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. "Good morning." A knock sounded at the chamber door. Chris stood up and walked across the room to open it. Two older women stood in the hallway holding folded garments. They kept their eyes lowered respectfully. Chris stepped aside to let them enter. "Dress her." He walked back to his desk and resumed reading a military report. The women approached Chloe with practiced efficiency. They brought a basin of warm water and a bars of simple soap. They washed the dirt from her face and hands quickly. They dressed her in a thick wool dress dyed a deep blue. It was simple, practical, and incredibly warm. They brushed her tangled hair and tied it back with a leather ribbon. Chloe looked down at her clean hands in wonder. The women bowed to Chris and left the room without saying a word. Chris rolled up his map. He turned to look at Chloe. She stood awkwardly by the bed, unsure of what to do next. "Come here." She walked over to his desk. He handed her a piece of hard cheese and a warm roll from his own breakfast tray. She took the food gratefully and began to eat. Chris waited for her to finish. "I have a council meeting." He picked up a heavy leather belt and buckled it around his waist. He attached his longsword to his left hip. "You will come with me." Chloe simply nodded. She wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve. Chris opened the heavy oak door and led her out into the corridor. Guards fell into step behind them instantly. They walked down the spiraling stone staircase toward the lower levels of the keep. The war room was located just behind the Great Hall. It was a circular chamber dominated by a massive stone table. 16 lords and generals were already gathered around the table. They were arguing loudly about grain shipments and border patrols. The heavy wooden doors swung open. The arguments stopped immediately. Every man in the room stood at rigid attention as Chris entered. He walked to the head of the table. Chloe followed closely behind him. The men stared at the small girl in absolute bewilderment. Chris sat down in his high-backed wooden chair. He gestured to an empty stool beside him. Chloe climbed onto the stool and sat quietly. Her feet dangled several inches above the stone floor. Chris leaned forward and rested his forearms on the table. Report. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Lord Vance, an older man with a gray beard, cleared his throat. He was known for his vast wealth and his barely concealed ambition. My king. Lord Vance bowed slightly. We were discussing the southern supply lines. He paused and looked directly at Chloe. His expression shifted into one of distinct disgust. But perhaps we should clear the rear of beggars before discussing matters of state. The war room plunged into a suffocating silence. Several generals took a slow step backward. Chloe shrank back on her stool. She recognized the cruel tone in the man's voice. She grabbed the edge of Chris's tunic with small, trembling fingers. Chris did not move. He did not raise his voice. He slowly turned his head to look at Lord Vance. His dark eyes were devoid of any emotion. What did you call her? Lord Vance lifted his chin defensively. She is a refugee from the camps, Your Grace. He gestured dismissively toward Chloe. She does not belong in the war room. Chris stood up. The scrape of his chair against the stone floor sounded like a warning bell. He walked slowly around the edge of the large table. Lord Vance held his ground, but a bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. Chris stopped directly in front of the older lord. The height difference made Vance look incredibly small. I decide who belongs in this room. Chris spoke with a terrifying calmness. You presume to question my judgment. Lord Vance swallowed hard. I only meant to protect the secrecy of our military plans. My king. Chris drew his sword. The steel hissed sharply against the leather scabbard. He did not swing the blade. He simply drove the heavy pommel of the sword directly into Lord Vance's chest. The older man collapsed onto the stone floor with a sharp gasp. He clutched his lubs in agony. Chris pointed the tip of his sword at Vance's throat. You meant to challenge me. The other lords held their breath. Chris looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every man present. This child stays by my side. He pressed the tip of the blade slightly closer to Vance's skin. If any man in this castle speaks of her with disrespect, he will lose his tongue. He lowered the sword slowly. If any man looks at her with malice, he will lose his eyes. He slid the long sword back into its scabbard with a sharp click. Do I make myself clear? A chorus of panicked voices answered immediately. Yes, my king. Understood, Your Grace. Chris looked down at Lord Vance, who was still struggling to breathe on the floor. Get out. Vance scrambled to his feet awkwardly. He bowed hastily and fled the room without looking back. Chris walked back to the head of the table. The remaining men watched him with renewed terror. Chris sat back down in his chair. He looked at Chloe. She was still gripping the edge of his stool, her eyes wide with shock. He reached out and placed his large hand gently over her small fingers. He did not say anything. The steady warmth of his hand was enough to calm her racing heart. Chloe let out a small breath and relaxed her grip. Chris turned his attention back to the maps on the table. Continue the report. A young general scrambled to unroll a parchment map. His hands were shaking noticeably. The southern passes are blocked by snow, my king. Chris listened carefully to the military update. He kept his left hand resting near Chloe. The atmosphere in the room remained incredibly tense. Nobody dared to look at the child again. They kept their eyes fixed firmly on the maps, or on the king. Chloe watched the men point at the parchment. She did not understand the talk of grain reserves and cavalry deployments. She only knew that the scary men were no longer allowed to hurt her. The meeting dragged on for 2 hours. Chris issued orders with sharp, precise efficiency. He redirected food supplies from the nobles' estates to the refugee camps. He ordered the city guard to repair the outer perimeter walls. He commanded absolute obedience, and the men provided it. When the meeting finally ended, the lords bowed and hurried out of the room. Chris remained seated at the large stone table. He rubbed his temples, slowly. Chloe reached over and patted his arm. You yelled at that man. Chris looked at her. He insulted you. Chloe thought about this for a moment. People in the camp yell at me all the time. Chris felt a cold anger flare in his chest. They will never yell at you again. He stood up and offered her his hand. Chloe placed her small hand in his. Where are we going now? Chris led her toward the heavy wooden doors. We are going to inspect the kitchens. He looked down at her. I promised you would never go hungry again. Chloe smiled. They walked out of the war room together. The guards fell into formation behind them. The castle staff scrambled out of their way as they walked down the corridor. Word of what had happened to Lord Vance was already spreading. Everyone in the keep now understood the new reality. The Alpha King had found a fragile weakness, and he had turned her into an untouchable, protected ward. The castle kitchens were a maze of roaring ovens and massive wooden tables. Dozens of servants rushed about with flour-dusted aprons. They froze instantly when Chris walked through the archway. A dropped copper pot clattered loudly against the stone tiles. Nobody moved to pick it up. Chris ignored the sudden, terrified stillness in the room. He walked toward the largest hearth and pulled out a heavy oak bench. He gestured for Chloe to sit. She scrabbled onto the bench and looked at the hanging, cured meats in awe. The head cook stepped forward with a deep, trembling bow. My king, we were not expecting you. Chris did not look at the man. Bring her food. The cook blinked rapidly. What would the child like, Your Grace? Everything. The kitchen exploded into frantic action. Servants rushed to the pantries and the cooling cellars. They sliced roasted meats and fetched warm, crusty bread. They brought bowls of thick stew and plates of sweet winter apples. Chloe watched the feast materialize before her with wide eyes. She had never seen so much food in one place. She looked up at Chris to silently ask for permission. He nodded once. She reached for a slice of warm bread and ate quickly. Chris sat on the bench beside her. He watched the frantic pace of the kitchen staff. They were terrified of making a single mistake. He turned his gaze back to Chloe. She focused all her attention on a bowl of rich beef stew. She ate with the desperate urgency of a child who had known true starvation. Chris felt a dull ache behind his eyes. It was a familiar pain, born of old war injuries and endless exhaustion. He rubbed his temple with a scarred hand. Chloe stopped eating immediately. She put her wooden spoon down on the table. She noticed the tight lines of strain around his mouth. Does your head hurt? Chris dropped his hand. It is nothing. He did not want to show weakness, even to her. Chloe did not return to her food. She slid across the bench until she was sitting right beside him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief. One of the maids had given it to her that morning. She dipped the cloth into a cup of cold water on the table. She wrung it out carefully with her small hands. Chris watched her with quiet confusion. Chloe stood up on the heavy oak bench to reach his height. She gently pressed the cool, damp cloth against his temple. Chris stiffened at the sudden contact. No one had touched him with gentle intent in years. His immediate instinct was to pull away. But Chloe's hands were soft and steady. "My mother used to do this when the fever came," she whispered. Chris closed his eyes. The cool water provided instant relief to his pounding headache. He sat perfectly still. He let a fragile, homeless child tend to his hidden pain. The kitchen staff watched from the corners of the room in silent shock. Chris was a man who slaughtered thousands on the battlefield. He was currently sitting with his eyes closed while a little girl patted his forehead. It was a sight that defied all logic. Chloe carefully moved the cloth across his brow. She hummed a very quiet, wordless tune. It was a simple melody meant to soothe a restless mind. Chris felt his tense muscles begin to relax. The heavy burden of the crown felt a fraction lighter. He opened his eyes and looked at her. She smiled down at him. "Better?" Chris nodded slowly. "Better." He reached up and took the cloth from her hands. He placed it on the table and gently guided her back down to her seat. "Finish your meal." Chloe happily picked up her spoon again. Chris remained seated beside her, leaning his back against the stone wall. The headache had indeed faded. It was replaced by a profound sense of calm. He realized he did not want to return to his dark, empty chambers. He wanted to stay right here in the warm kitchen. When Chloe finally pushed her empty plate away, she let out a contented sigh. She looked sleepy again. The massive meal and the warmth of the ovens were taking their toll. Chris stood up and lifted her into his arms effortlessly. She rested her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. He walked out of the kitchen without a word. The servants bowed deeply as he passed. He carried her up the spiraling stone stairs. He did not head toward his private quarters this time. He turned down a long, quiet corridor in the east wing. He stalked in front of a pair of heavy iron doors. 2 guards scrambled to push them open. Chris stepped into the royal library. It was a massive, circular room filled with thousands of ancient books. Tall windows let in the pale afternoon light. A large fireplace stood unlit against the far wall. Chris ordered the guards to light the fire. He carried Chloe over to a large, velvet armchair near the hearth. He sat down with her still resting in his lap. The room quickly grew warm. Chris reached over and pulled a heavy leather-bound book from a nearby table. It was an ancient history of the northern kingdoms. He opened it with one hand while holding Chloe securely with the other. He read in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the turning of thick parchment pages. Chloe woke up an hour later. She rubbed her eyes and looked around the vast library. She stared at the endless rows of books with pure wonder. "What is this place?" Chris closed his book and set it aside. "It is a library." Chloe tilted her head. "Are there stories in them?" "Yes." Chloe looked at the heavy book on the table. "Can you read one to me?" Chris looked at her in surprise. No one had ever asked him to read a story. His generals asked for orders, and his enemies begged for mercy. He picked up the heavy volume again. This is a history of war and conquest. Chloe did not look deterred. I still want to hear it. Chris opened the book to the first chapter. He cleared his throat. He began to read the ancient text aloud. His voice was deep and resonant in the quiet room. He read about harsh winters and brutal battles. He read about forgotten kings and shattered empires. Chloe listened with rapt attention. She did not understand all the complex words, but she loved the steady, rumbling sound of his voice. She rested her chin on his chest and closed her eyes again. Chris read for another hour. He found a strange rhythm in the archaic words. He realized he was no longer reading just to pass the time. He was reading to maintain the fragile peace in the room. He eventually reached the end of a long chapter. He stopped speaking and closed the book quietly. Chloe was fast asleep once more. Chris looked down at her small, peaceful face. He carefully brushed a stray lock of hair away from her forehead. He knew the lords of the court were currently plotting in the shadows. He knew they viewed his sudden attachment to this child as a fatal weakness. They believed he had grown soft and vulnerable. They were severely mistaken. Chris felt his jaw clench as he thought of Lord Vance. He would not let anyone harm her. He had spent his entire life destroying his enemies. He would gladly burn the kingdom to ash to keep her safe. He held her a little tighter against his chest. The silence in the library was profound. It was the silence of unwavering protection. He gently shifted Chloe off his lap and placed her into the deep velvet chair. She murmured softly, but did not wake. He stood up and walked to the nearest window. The wind howled with a vicious, relentless energy. He placed his large hand against the freezing glass pane. The cold seeped into his skin, a stark reminder of the harsh reality outside. He turned away from the window and walked back to the heavy iron doors. He opened them and found his guard captain waiting in the corridor. "Captain," the man snapped to attention. "Move the refugees into the lower keep." The captain hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The lower keep is meant for the garrison, my king." Chris stared at the man with cold, unwavering intensity. "The garrison will share their fires." He lowered his voice to a dangerous murmur. "No one dies of the cold tonight." The captain swallowed hard and bowed. "It will be done immediately, Your Grace." Chris closed the doors and returned to the quiet library. He walked back to the velvet chair. Chloe was still sleeping deeply, oblivious to the storm. He sat on the thick rug beside her chair. He crossed his legs and leaned back against the stone hearth. He watched the flames dance and consume the dry wood. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose that did not involve violence. He had built a kingdom on a foundation of fear and dominance. Yet none of those victories felt as significant as the quiet breathing of the child beside him. The heavy iron doors opened slowly with a dull creak. Chris turned his head sharply. His hand dropped instinctively to the dagger strapped to his thigh. The elderly head scholar of the castle stepped cautiously into the room. The man froze when he saw Chris sitting on the floor. He bowed hastily, his arms trembling slightly. "My king, I apologize for the intrusion." Chris withdrew his hand from the dagger. "Speak softly." The scholar nodded and lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. "The council has requested an emergency audience in the Great Hall." Chris did not move. "Tell them to wait." The scholar hesitated, clearly terrified of delivering bad news. "Lord Vance has formally petitioned the High Lords to challenge your recent decrees." Chris felt a cold, familiar rage coil in his stomach. He had spared Vance's life in the war room. That at Mercy had been a mistake. Tell the council I will join them shortly. The scholar bowed again and practically ran out of the room. Chris looked back at Chloe. She was still sleeping soundly. He stood up and adjusted his heavy sword belt. He walked to the doorway and spoke to the guards stationed outside. No one enters this room. The guards slammed their fists against their breastplates in salute. Chris turned and walked down the long corridor toward the great hall. His footsteps echoed heavily against the stone. He was done showing mercy to those who questioned his authority. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the great hall. The lords fell silent as he walked toward the iron throne. He did not sit down. He stood before the throne and rested his hand on the pommel of his sword. His eyes locked onto Lord Vance, who stood trembling in the center of the room. The real war was just beginning. Chris stared down at the assembled council. The torches flickered wildly in the drafty hall. Lord Vance stood in the center of the room with 10 armed mercenaries. The older man wore heavy chainmail beneath his velvet tunic. He had clearly planned an armed insurrection. Murmurs echoed among the other lords. They watched the confrontation with calculated interest. Chris did not draw his sword. He walked slowly down the stone steps. Vance raised a trembling hand to signal his mercenaries. "You have broken the ancient pacts, Chris." Vance spat the words with feigned courage. "You empty our granaries for worthless vagrants." Chris took another step forward. "You bring street vermin into the royal sanctuary." Vance drew his broadsword with a heavy metallic scrape. "The High Lords will no longer tolerate this madness." His 10 mercenaries tightened their grip on their weapons. They formed a protective half-circle around their employer. Chris stopped 10 paces away from the armed group. He felt the familiar, malevolent energy stirring in his blood. It was the dark power that had originally secured his crown. He had kept it dormant for 3 years. Now, he let the abyss open within his mind. Shadows leaked from the seams of the stone floor. The temperature in the great hall plummeted instantly. Frost crawled rapidly across the iron braziers. The firelight dimmed into a wave of unnatural darkness. Vance stumbled backward as the shadows coiled around his boots. "Kill him!" The desperate command shattered the silence. The mercenaries lunged forward with raised weapons. Chris raised his right hand. He unleashed a torrent of pure kinetic force. The unseen pressure slammed into the charging men. It threw them backward like discarded yodbills. They crashed against the heavy oak doors with bone-shattering impact. Steel shattered and armor crumpled under the immense weight. No blood spilled upon the polished floor. The men simply collapsed into unconscious heaps. Chris lowered his hand slowly. His dark gaze locked onto Vance. The older lord was now trapped against the stone steps. Thick bands of solid shadow wrapped around his ankles. Vance dropped his broadsword in sheer terror. The blade clattered uselessly against the stone. Chris walked toward the cowering man. His footsteps echoed like a death knell. "You speak of ancient pacts?" Chris stopped right in front of him. "You forget how I forged this kingdom." He reached out and grasped Vance by the throat. His immense strength lifted the older man entirely off the ground. Vance gasped for air, his face turning a sickly purple. Chris tightened his grip marginally. "My word is the only law." He threw Vance aside with a casual flick of his wrist. The defeated lord hit the floor and scrambled away on his hands and knees. Vance coughed violently while gasping for breath. Chris turned to face the rest of the silent council. The nobles stood frozen in abject horror. "Vance will be stripped of his lands." Chris delivered the sentence with icy sovereignty. "His wealth will be diverted to the lower keep." He pointed a scarred finger at the trembling lords. "Any man who questions my decrees will share his fate." Nobody dared to argue. They fell to their knees in a synchronized wave of submission. "Long live the king," they chanted in hushed, terrified voices. Chris turned his back on them. He walked past the unconscious mercenaries. One man wore the crest of a neighboring province on his shoulder. It was a blatant sign of foreign interference. Chris memorized the insignia instantly. He would deal with the foreign lords in due time. His immediate priority was absolute domestic control. He ordered the royal scribe to draft a new proclamation. The decree would confiscate all private arsenals within the capital. He watched the scribe's hands shake as the ink hit the parchment. "Send this to every estate before midnight." The scribe bowed frantically and ran from the hall. Chris remained standing before the throne. He let the dark energy recede back into his veins. The shadows dissolved from the stone floor entirely. The torches flared brightly once again. He rubbed his tired eyes. Violence always left a hollow ache in his chest. He walked down the private corridor toward the washroom. He stripped off his tunic and splashed his face with freezing water. He scrubbed his hands until his skin turned red. Chris wanted no trace of the conflict left upon him. He dried his face with a rough linen towel. He pulled on a clean, dark shirt. He walked back toward the east wing. The castle was unnervingly quiet now. Fear had silenced the usual chatter of the servants. Chris reached the heavy iron doors of the library. 2 guards snapped to attention immediately. He opened the doors slowly to avoid making a sound. The fire in the hearth still burned steadily. The vast room felt incredibly warm and peaceful. Chris walked over to the velvet armchair. Chloe was awake. She sat with her knees pulled up to her chest. She held a large, ancient map in her small hands. She looked up when he approached. "You were gone a long time?" Chris sat down on the thick rug beside her chair. "I had to resolve a dispute." Chloe studied his face carefully. She saw the lingering tension in his jaw. She folded the map and placed it on the small table. "Did the bad men yell at you again?" Chris offered a faint, bitter smile. "They will not yell anymore." Chloe leaned forward and rested her chin on her knees. "Good." She reached out and patted his shoulder. "You should not have to fight." Chris closed his eyes for a moment. The simple innocence of her words struck him deeply. He had fought every single day of his miserable life. Sometimes fighting is necessary. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "It is how we protect what matters." Chloe tilted her head in thought. "My mother told me stories about knights." She traced a pattern on the velvet armrest. "They protected the weak." Chris stared at the dancing flames. He had never considered himself a knight. He was a conqueror, forged in betrayal and blood. Yet, sitting here in the warm glow of the fire, he felt a strange shift. He looked back at the small girl. She trusted him completely. She did not see the monster that the council feared. She only saw the man who gave her bread and a warm fire. "I am no knight, Chloe." He spoke the words with quiet honesty. Chloe shook her head stubbornly. "You gave me your cloak." She pointed to the heavy fur garment draped over the chair. "You gave me food." She looked him straight in the eyes. "Knights do that." Chris felt that unfamiliar tightness in his throat again. He reached out and smoothed her messy hair. "If you say so." He picked up the ancient map she had been holding. It depicted the known world before the Great Winter. "Do you like maps?" Chloe nodded slowly. "They show places without snow." Chris traced the faded coastline with his finger. "There are lands across the southern sea." He kept his voice low and even.
They have green fields and warm winds. Chloe's eyes widened with genuine curiosity. Have you been there? Chris closed the map. No. He placed it back on the table carefully. But perhaps I will take you there one day. Chloe smiled at the promise. I would like that. A soft knock sounded at the library doors. Chris turned his head sharply. The guard captain stepped inside and bowed low. My king, the refugees have been relocated to the lower keep. The man spoke with a newfound, breathless reverence. Fires have been lit, and provisions are secured. Chris nodded once in acknowledgement. Post additional guards at the perimeter. It will be on your grace. The captain bowed again and retreated quickly. Chris looked back at Chloe. Her smile had grown even brighter. My friends will be warm tonight. Chris felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had defied the entire ruling class for this one smile. It was the greatest victory of his reign. He stood up and offered his hand. It is getting late. Chloe placed her small fingers in his palm. She slipped down from the oversized chair. Chris pulled his heavy cloak from the backrest. He draped it over her shoulders once again. They walked out of the library together. The stone corridors were dark and silent. They walked toward his tribe's chambers at a slow pace. Guards snapped to attention as they passed. Chris opened the heavy oak door to his room. The maids had already lit the fire and prepared the bed. He guided Chloe toward the warm mattress. Sleep. Chloe climbed under the thick furs. She looked up at him as he sat in his wooden chair by the hearth. Are you going to stay there all night? Chris rested his elbows on his knees. Yes. He watched her close her eyes. He knew the lords would regroup eventually. Vance's allies would whisper in the dark corners of the keep. They would try to find a way to undermine his authority. They would certainly try to target his only perceived weakness. Chris welcomed the challenge. He would turn this frozen kingdom into an impenetrable fortress. He pulled his dagger from its sheath. His large hand picked up a small block of firewood. The sharp steel bit into the timber with steady, precise strokes. It was an old habit from his days in the military camps. He carved the rough shape of a hunting hound. The sharp blade shaved away the excess timber smoothly. He wanted to make a simple toy for her. It was a trivial gesture for a reigning monarch. Yet it felt incredibly important to him right now. He brushed the wood shavings into the hearth. The small wooden dog sat squarely on his palm. He placed it gently on the table beside her bed. She would find it when she woke. Chris leaned back in his wooden chair. He finally allowed himself to rest. Sunlight streamed dimly through the thick, frosted windows of the royal bedchamber. Chloe stirred beneath the heavy layers of wool and fur. Her small fingers brushed against a hard, unfamiliar object resting on the bedside table. She turned her head slowly to inspect the roughly carved wooden hound. A wide, brilliant smile broke across her face. She picked up the small toy and held it securely against her chest. Chris was already awake and standing near the roaring hearth. He watched her reaction quietly while adjusting his thick leather sword belt. Do you like it? His voice sounded notably less harsh in the quiet morning air. Chloe nodded enthusiastically. He looks very brave. She ran her thumb over the smooth, carefully whittled edges of the wood. I will name him Barnaby. Chris arched a scarred eyebrow slightly at the unusual choice. That was certainly not a name fit for a fearsome hunting hound. Barnaby, he repeated slowly, testing the sound. It felt completely foreign on his tongue. He is a good protector, Chloe declared with absolute certainty. She placed the wooden dog carefully back on the soft pillow. Morning routines within the royal apartments had shifted drastically overnight. Maids brought basins of fresh water without their usual trembling terror. They had quickly realized the terrifying king was entirely focused on his young ward. Breakfast arrived on a large silver tray shortly after.
Warm bread, roasted meats, and salted butter filled the room with a comforting aroma. Chris sat beside her at the heavy oak dining table. He poured her a silver cup full of warm goat's milk. Chloe ate her meal happily, while keeping the wooden dog right next to her plate. A neat stack of blank parchment rested at the far edge of the table. Chris noticed her glancing repeatedly at the curled edges of the paper. "Do you know your letters?" She shook her head, looking slightly ashamed of the admission. "My mother did not have time to teach me before she got sick." Chris pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward the center of the table. He uncorked a small glass bottle of dark black ink. "I will teach you." He handed her a sleek, finely trimmed raven feather quill. Chloe took the writing instrument awkwardly, gripping the fragile stem far too tight. Chris moved his heavy wooden chair much closer to hers. His massive, calloused hand covered hers gently to correct the improper grip. "Hold it lightly." The immense warrior guided her small hand toward the open inkwell. "A tight grape will snap the feather." They dipped the sharp tip into the dark ink together. He guided her hand to press the quill firmly against the rough parchment. "We will start with your name." Chris moved her hand in slow, highly deliberate strokes. The letter C curled elegantly across the top of the page. Chloe watched the black ink flow in utter fascination. "It looks like a half moon." Chris chuckled softly at the comparison. The sound was rusty and unfamiliar, echoing strangely in the quiet room. He continued to guide her tidy hand through the remaining letters. The word Chloe soon sat proudly across the center of the blank page. She traced the drying ink gently with her free hand. "That is me." Chris released her hand and leaned back in his chair. "Now try it alone." He watched patiently as she struggled to replicate the elegant shapes. Her newly formed letters were crooked and noticeably uneven. Yet she worked with an intense, unwavering focus that impressed him. Chris felt a deep, grounding warmth spreading rapidly through his chest. He had signed countless execution orders and brutal war declarations in his life. Teaching a refugee child to write her name felt infinitely more important than any of those documents. The peaceful morning atmosphere shattered completely less than an hour later. A young kitchen servant entered the room carrying a woven basket of winter apples. The boy kept his head bowed unusually low to avoid eye contact. His hands shook violently as he placed the basket on the edge of the table. Chris narrowed his dark eyes instantly. He had survived a dozen vicious assassination attempts before ever claiming the throne. Paranoia was a deeply ingrained survival instinct that never truly slept. Chloe reached excitedly for a bright red apple near the top of the pile. Chris moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. His large hand clamped down hard on the servant's wrist before Chloe could even touch the fruit. The woven basket tipped over, sending apples spilling across the stone tiles. "Who sent you?" Chris kept his voice lowered to a lethal, promising whisper. The young Serzert boy collapsed to his knees and began sobbing instantly. "They threatened to kill my sisters, Your Grace." Chris inspected the scattered apples rolling near his heavy boots. A faint, unnatural sheen coated the waxy skin of the fruit. It was a rare southern poison designed specifically to mimic a natural, deadly fever. His political enemies had finally realized they could never defeat him in open combat. They had cowardly chosen to target the only thing he actually cared about instead.
Chloe sat frozen in her wooden chair. She looked frantically from the crying boy to the dark fury building in Chris's eyes. She did not fully understand the danger, but she could easily feel the sudden shift in the room. Chris did not strike the weeping servant. He released the boy's wrist with a look of absolute, chilling disgust. Guards. The heavy oak doors burst open instantly as armed men flooded the room. Take him to the holding cells. Chris issued the command without looking away from the poisoned fruit. Do not harm him until I have extracted names. The armored guards dragged the hysterical boy away down the corridor. Chris stood completely still in the center of the room. The walls of his own private sanctuary had been successfully breached. He realized in that moment that temporary protection would always be insufficient. He turned slowly to face Chloe. She was clutching the small wooden dog tightly against her chest for comfort. Her bright eyes were wide, returning fear and confusion. Chris knelt down on the cold floor directly in front of her. He completely ignored the poisoned apples resting near his knees. I am sorry. He spoke the apology with a raw, uncharacteristic sincerity. Chloe hesitated for a moment before reaching out to touch his broad shoulder.
Why was that boy crying so much? Because bad men forced him to do a very terrible thing. Chris covered her small, trembling hand with his own warm palm. But they will never reach you. He stood up to his full, intimidating height and pulled her gently into his arms. She wrapped her legs around his armored waist instinctively. He carried her swiftly out of the tainted room. The great hall was already bustling with the usual morning court activities. Chris walked through the heavy iron doors carrying his young ward. The casual chatter of the nobility died almost instantly. Aristocrats parted like the sea to clear a wide path for their monarch. He did not stop at the base of the elevated stone steps. He walked directly up to the massive iron throne. Chris sat down heavily, keeping Chloe securely seated upon his lap. The entire gathered court watched the display in stunned, breathless silence. The king's scarred face was a mask of cold, unyielding iron. He signaled sharply for the royal herald to step forward. The nervous herald scurried quickly to the base of the royal steps. "Summon the high priest," Chris commanded loudly. Frantic whispers erupted across the hall before dying down just as rapidly. The high priest was traditionally only summoned for coronations and royal weddings. An elderly man draped in pristine white robes arrived nearly 10 minutes later. He bowed deeply and respectfully before the towering throne. "You called for my presence, my king." Chris stood up gracefully while holding Chloe's small hand. He guided her to stand proudly on the raised dais beside him. "Bring forth the royal registry." The high priest blinked repeatedly in obvious confusion. "The registry of bloodlines, your grace?" "Yes." A royal scribe quickly fetched the massive gold-bound leather ledger from the archives. Chris looked out over the vast sea of anxious, calculating nobles. "Some among you believe you can threaten what is rightfully mine." His booming voice carried effortlessly to the furthest corners of the cavernous room. "You mistakenly believe shadows and hidden poisons will break my resolve." Several wealthy lords looked nervously down at the polished floorboards. "You are gravely mistaken." Chris looked down at Chloe standing bravely by his side. She looked up at him with a gaze full of complete, unwavering trust. He turned his attention back to the waiting high priest. "Record her name." The old man raised his ink-stained quill with visibly trembling fingers. "As a royal ward under your protection, my king." "As my daughter." The heavy words struck the great hall like a physical blow to the chest. Loud gasps rang out sharply from the assembled nobility. A homeless refugee child from the freezing lower camps was being elevated to the highest station in the realm. Record her officially as Princess Chloe." Chris placed his large, protective hand firmly off her thin shoulder. "She is now the sole heir to the Northern Kingdom." The high priest swallowed hard and dipped his quill deeply into the inkwell. He carefully wrote the name into the ancient, sacred pages of the book. "It is done, Your Grace." Chris addressed the thoroughly stunned court one final time. "Any threat against her life is now considered high treason against the crown itself." He drew his long sword exactly 1 inch from its leather scabbard to emphasize the fatal point. "There will be no lengthy trials for treason." He pushed the shining blade back into place with a sharp, echoing click. "There will only be immediate executions." Chloe did not fully grasp the monumental political weight of the moment. She only knew that Chris had just publicly promised to keep her forever. She leaned comfortably against his armored leg, feeling completely and utterly safe. Chris looked down and offered her a rare, genuinely warm smile. The Alpha King had finally found a true reason to rule his frozen empire. Life changed rapidly for Chloe after the public declaration in the Great Hall. She was no longer a nameless refugee wandering the freezing courtyards. Servants addressed her strictly as princess whenever they crossed paths. They bowed respectfully and offered immediate assistance at all times. Chris relocated her into a grand suite adjacent to his own private chambers. The new room featured a massive stone hearth and thick wool tapestries. He refused to leave her safety in the hands of regular palace guards. He personally scoured the ranks of his veteran military commanders instead. He eventually selected a battle-hardened female knight named Bryn. Bryn possessed a severe, scarred face and a reputation for absolute loyalty. She moved into the adjoining room to maintain a constant vigil over the child. Chloe was initially intimidated by the towering woman in heavy chainmail. That fear vanished completely when Bryn clumsily attempted to braid her hair.
The fierce warrior treated the small girl with unexpected, awkward gentleness. Chris observed this growing bond with quiet satisfaction. He spent his early mornings teaching Chloe how to read the ancient maps. They studied the intricate trade routes and the jagged mountain borders together. He wanted her to understand the vast kingdom she would one day inherit. Afternoons were strictly reserved for holding court and settling domestic disputes. Chris usually handled these matters with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. Everything shifted. During a particularly tense judgment on a cold Tuesday, a terrified peasant was dragged before the Iron Throne in heavy iron chains. The man had been caught stealing a large sack of grain from the royal storehouses. The penalty for stealing from the crown was traditionally the loss of a hand. The royal steward recited the formal charges with a loud, condemning voice. Chris sat rigidly on his throne with his jaw tightly clenched. He raised his hand to deliver the customary violent sentence. Chloe suddenly stood up from her small wooden stool beside the dais. She walked down the stone steps and stopped directly in front of the kneeling thief. The entire court held its collective breath in absolute shock. She looked at the man's hollow cheeks and his freezing bare feet. Memories of her own brutal starvation flared vividly in her young mind. She turned around to face Chris directly. "He is only hungry." Her small voice carried a remarkable clarity through the silent hall. "You opened the granaries for the camp, but perhaps food did not reach his village." Chris lowered his hand slowly. He looked at the desperate peasant and then back at his daughter. A murmuring wave of disbelief rippled through the assembled nobility. Nobody ever dared to interrupt a royal execution order. Chris did not reprimand her for the sudden, unprecedented interruption. He simply leaned forward and fixed his dark eyes on the trembling thief. "Do you have a family?" The peasant nodded frantically while tears streamed down his dirt-streaked face. "A wife and 3 daughters, Your Grace." Chris remained silent for a long, agonizing moment. The strict laws of the kingdom demanded immediate physical retribution. He looked at Chloe, who was watching him with wide, pleading eyes. She had given him a stale piece of bread when he was drowning in isolation. He realized he could not punish a man for trying to feed his own starving children. Release him. The two guards holding the prisoner hesitated in sheer confusion. Chris stood up and rested his heavy hand on the pommel of his sword. I said release him. The guards quickly unlocked the heavy iron chains and stepped away. Chris turned his attention back to the royal steward. Send a wagon of grain to this man's village before nightfall. He stepped down from the dais and gently took Chloe's hand. And ensure the distribution routes are thoroughly audited by morning. The peasant collapsed against the floor, sobbing out hysterical prayers of gratitude. Chris led Chloe out of the great hall without looking back. Word of the event spread through the lower city like wildfire. The common people began to whisper about the miraculous influence of the new princess. They called her the Winter Rose. She had successfully brought warmth to a monarch forged entirely in ice. Peace seemed to finally settle over the towering northern fortress for a short time. It was a fragile illusion built on temporary compliance. Danger was quietly gathering beyond the heavy iron gates. A massive blizzard struck the capital late Thursday evening. Relentless winds battered the castle walls with a deafening constant howl. Thick snow piled rapidly against the wooden doors of the lower keep. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet in the suffocating whiteout. Most of the city guard huddled closely around roaring fires in the barracks. They mistakenly believed the brutal weather provided a natural, impenetrable defense. Lord Vance had planned his desperate retaliation perfectly. He had spent his remaining gold to hire 50 elite foreign mercenaries. These men were trained assassins who thrived in the chaotic darkness. They wore white cloaks that rendered them entirely invisible against the driving snow. Vance had also bribed the captain of the Western Gatehouse hours earlier. The heavy iron portcullis was silently raised a few crucial inches. The assassins slipped beneath the spiked gate like lethal ghosts. They moved through the outer courtyard with practiced, deadly silence. Their blades were coated in the same dark poison used on the apples. Vance stood in the shadows of the outer wall, watching his investment go to work. He did not care about reclaiming his lost political seat anymore. He only wanted to see Chris suffer unimaginable grief. The mercenaries bypassed the main barracks entirely. They scaled the rough stone walls of the eastern tower using iron grappling hooks. The howling wind easily masked the metallic clinking of their gear. They reached the upper balconies, connecting directly to the royal apartments. Chris was awake inside his chambers. He was sitting in his wooden chair, sharpening his long sword with a whetstone. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the quiet room. Chloe was sleeping sound dead in her own bed next door. Bryn was standing guard perfectly still in the connecting hallway. Chris paused his sharpening suddenly. His military instincts flared with a sharp, undeniable warning. The wind outside sounded slightly different near the balcony doors. It was a subtle shift in air pressure, caused by a body blocking the draft. He placed the whetstone down onto the table without making a sound. He stood up and gripped the leather hilt of his heavy sword. A shadow detached itself from the balcony railing outside. The glass pane shattered inward with a violent, explosive crash. 3 assassins tumbled into the room wrapped in their white cloaks. They recovered their footing instantly and lunged forward with poisoned daggers. Chris did not flinch or shout for the guards. He met their charge with cold, calculating precision. He ducked beneath the first thrust and drove his elbow into the attacker's ribs. The man collapsed with a sharp gasp as bone cracked loudly. The second assassin swung a short sword toward his throat. Chris parried the strike effortlessly and countered with a brutal knee to the stomach.
He kicked the third man squarely in the chest, sending him crashing into the heavy desk. The brief skirmish lasted less than 10 seconds. However, the breaking glass had already alerted the rest of the castle. Heavy footsteps thundered down the main corridor outside. Chris drove his blade through the wooden door just as another mercenary tried to breach it. A muffled scream echoed from the hallway. He ripped the sword free and kicked the splintered door open. The hallway was swarming with Vance's paid killers. Bryn was already engaged in a vicious fight near Chloe's bedroom door. The female knight swung her broadsword with terrifying, absolute ferocity. She cleanly disarmed a mercenary and threw him over the stone banister. Chris stepped out of his room and joined the fray immediately. He fought with a controlled, devastating fury. He used raw, practiced martial dominance to dismantle his enemies. His sword moved faster than the eye could follow. He dropped 3 more assassins before they could even raise their weapons. "Protect the door!" He shouted the command to Bryn over the clash of ringing steel. "None of them enter her room." Bryn nodded grimly and planted her boots firmly in front of the heavy oak frame. Chris pushed forward to meet the next wave of attackers head-on. He was a one-man vanguard holding the narrow corridor completely alone. The intruders quickly realized they had walked into a fatal trap. They were not fighting a complacent king. They were fighting an enraged father defending his only child. Chloe woke up to the terrifying sound of shattering glass and langing metal. She sat up in her bed and clutched the thick wool blankets securely. The wooden hound, Barnaby, fell onto the rug from her sudden movement. She heard Chris shouting commands in the hallway outside her door. His voice sounded like a roaring thunderstorm echoing through the stone walls. She scrambled out of bed and picked up the small carved toy. She did not scream or cry in the dark room. Her difficult past had taught her to remain perfectly silent during moments of danger. She hid quietly in the narrow space between the heavy wardrobe and the wall. She listened as heavy bodies crashed violently against the outer walls. Bryn was roaring battle cries just on the other side of the wood. The sounds of combat were terrifying. Yet Chloe felt a strange sense of security. She knew Chris was standing between her and the monsters in the dark. The fierce battle in the narrow corridor reached its violent conclusion. Chris moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency through the remaining mercenaries. He deflected a desperate sword thrust and countered with a devastating strike to his opponent's chest. Enemies fell rapidly before his overwhelming martial dominance. Bryn fought equally hard by the heavy oak bedroom door. She slammed her heavy steel shield squarely into the face of a charging attacker. The man collapsed backward into the stone wall and did not rise again. Only the howling wind from the shattered balcony doors broke the sudden silence. Chris lowered his long sword and took a deep, steadying breath. His dark shirt was torn near the shoulder, but he had sustained no serious injuries. He stepped carefully over the unconscious bodies littering the polished floorboards. "Secure the perimeter immediately," Chris commanded his arriving guards. Dozens of armored soldiers flooded the hallway to drag the defeated mercenaries away. Chris pushed open the splintered wooden door to his daughter's bedroom. The room was completely dark and eerily quiet. "Chloe." He called her name softly to avoid startling her in the shadows. There was a slight rustle of fabric near the back wall. Chris walked quickly toward the massive wooden wardrobe. He found her wedged safely in the narrow gap between the heavy furniture and the stone masonry. She was still gripping the small wooden hound tightly against her chest. He dropped his weapon onto the rug with a muffled thud. Chris fell to his knees immediately to reach her eye level. He reached out his large, scarred hands with absolute gentleness. Chloe did not hesitate to climb out of her dark hiding spot. She threw her thin arms around his thick neck and buried her face in his shoulder. He pulled her against his broad chest, letting out a long breath of pure relief. "You are safe," he murmured the reassuring words into her messy hair while rubbing her back. "The bad men are gone." Chloe looked up at him with wide, observant eyes. She noticed the ripped fabric on his sleeve and the deep exhaustion lining his face. She reached out and pressed the wooden hound directly into his large palm. "Barnaby will protect you now." Chris looked down at the roughly carved toy sitting in his massive hand. A cold, calculating fury instantly replaced his lingering anxiety. He realized that playing defensive politics would only invite more attacks on this room. Vance had crossed the absolute final line tonight. Chris stood up and lifted Chloe effortlessly into his arms. He carried her back to the large bed and tucked her beneath the thick winter furs. Bryn stepped into the room with her broadsword still drawn. Her armor was severely dented, yet her posture remained perfectly rigid. "My king, the castle is completely locked down." Chris turned his head to look at the loyal female knight. "Do not leave this room under any circumstances." He walked over to the hearth and stirred the dying embers with an iron poker. "If anyone other than myself attempts to enter, kill them without hesitation." Bryn slammed a mailed fist against her breastplate in a solemn salute. "Upon my life, your grace." Chris walked back out into the ruined corridor. The captain of the guard was currently barking aggressive orders at his men to clear the debris. Chris strode past the soldiers and headed straight for the maid armory in the lower keep. He did not bother to put on his heavy ceremonial armor. He simply grabbed a thick winter cloak and a fresh steel dagger from the rack. He was going to permanently end this rebellion tonight. Chris marched out to the main courtyard where 20 elite Leo guards waited in formation. The blizzard was still raging with terrifying, blinding intensity. Thick snow lashed aggressively against their dark cloaks and iron helmets. "Vance is hiding at the old toll house near the western gate." Chris spoke loudly over the screaming wind to ensure his men heard him. He had correctly deduced the traitor's location based on the breached security point. "We take no prisoners tonight." The royal guards drew their weapons in perfect, lethal synchronization. Chris led the brutal march through the knee-deep snow of the lower city. The freezing wind felt like a minor inconvenience compared to the dark fire burning in his chest. He would gladly burn the entire world to ash to ensure Chloe could sleep peacefully. They reached the abandoned toll house on the outskirts of the capital 30 minutes later. A dozen foreign mercenaries stood guard outside the heavily fortified wooden doors. They never even had a chance to sound the alarm. Chris did not rely on standard military tactics for this particular assault. He summoned the dark, dormant power within his blood once again. Black shadows erupted violently from the frozen earth beneath his heavy boots. The malevolent energy swept forward like a tidal wave of pure kinetic destruction. It slammed violently into the guards, crushing their armor and throwing them into the deep snowdrifts. Chris walked right through the center of the dark storm. He raised his right hand and clenched his fist tightly in the freezing air. The massive wooden doors of the toll house shattered inward into 1,000 deadly splinters. The elite guards swarmed into the building immediately behind him. They executed the remaining mercenaries with brutal, silent efficiency. Chris stepped slowly into the main room of the old structure. Lord Vance was sitting frozen behind a rotting wooden table. The older man dropped his silver wine goblet in sheer terror when the Alpha King walked through the ruined doorway. Shadows still clung fiercely to Chris's broad shoulders like a living cape. He looked like a mythological god of war stepping directly out of a nightmare. "You failed." Chris delivered the two words with a chilling, absolute finality. Vance scrambled backward, tipping his heavy wooden chair over in the desperate process. "It was the foreign lords." The desperate traitor pointed a shaking finger at the dead mercenaries littering the floor. "They forced me to open the gates, Chris." Chris closed the distance between them in 3 long, predatory strides. He did not summon his dark magic for this specific task. He used his immense physical strength to lift Vance entirely off the floor by his expensive velvet tunic. "You brought assassins to my daughter's door." Chris slammed the older man aggressively against the rough stone wall. The brutal impact knocked the remaining breath directly from Vance's lungs. "There are no foreign lords to hide behind tonight." Chris drew the fresh steel dagger slowly from his leather belt. He did not execute the traitor with a quick, merciful strike. He drove the thick blade straight through the wooden support beam directly next to Vance's ear. The loud thunk made the older man scream aloud in raw terror. Chris leaned his face in very close. "Your lands belong entirely to the crown." He spoke in a low voice, completely devoid of any human empathy. "Your family name is erased from the royal ledgers forever." He released his powerful grip, letting Vance collapse into a pathetic heap on the dirt floor. "You will spend the rest of your miserable life breaking rocks in the northern mines." Chris looked down at the broken man with utter, profound disgust. Death was a swift release that Vance simply did not deserve. He turned his broad back on the traitor and walked toward the exit. "Chain him," he ordered his waiting guards. The soldiers dragged the weeping Vance out into the raging blizzard. Chris stepped back out into the freezing night air. The storm had already begun to clear, revealing a bright, full moon hanging above the jagged mountains. He had surgically excised the deepest rot from his capital. He felt an overwhelming, desperate need to return to the royal apartments immediately. The long march back to the stone keep was silent and victorious. Chris moved rapidly through the quiet castle corridors without speaking to his men. He reached the east wing and stopped outside the shattered wooden doors. Bryn was still standing exactly where he had left her. She lowered her broadsword slightly when she finally recognized his dark silhouette. Chris nodded at the fiercely loyal note and opened the bedroom door very quietly. The fire was still burning warmly in the large stone hearth. Chloe was fast asleep beneath a mountain of thick woolen blankets. The wooden hound was resting peacefully right beside her pillow. Chris walked over to the large bed and sat in his heavy wooden chair. He rested his elbows on his knees and watched her breathe evenly. The absolute security of the northern fortress had finally been restored. Morning finally broke over the jagged eastern mountains. Pale sunlight filtered slowly through the cracked window of the royal bedchamber. Chris remained seated in his wooden chair beside the heavy mattress. He had not slept a single wink during the long night. His dark eyes stayed fixed on the rhythmic breathing of his young ward. Chloe shifted beneath the thick wool blankets and slowly opened her eyes. She blinked several times at the bright morning light filling the room. Her small hand immediately reached out to find the carved wooden toy. Barnaby was still resting safely near the edge of her soft pillow. She sat up and looked directly at the weary king. "You stayed awake." Chris leaned forward and rested his elbows on his armored knees. "I promised to keep you safe." He reached out and gently smoothed her tangled hair. "The bad men will never return to this castle." Chloe smiled brightly and leaned into this warm touch. That simple, quiet morning marked the true beginning of a new era. The brutal suppression of the rebellion changed the political landscape entirely. Fear of the Alpha King still kept the ambitious nobles firmly in line. However, a new sense of genuine respect began to take root among the commoners. Chris spent the following months completely restructuring the northern economy. He funneled confiscated wealth from traitorous lords directly into the lower city. Stonemasons quickly repaired the crumbling walls of the outer districts. Carpenters built sturdy new homes for the displaced refugee families. The sprawling camps in the lower courtyards slowly disappeared. They were replaced by bustling markets and warm, communal hearths. Chris personally ensured the southern grain shipments arrived on time every single week. He established new trade agreements to guarantee permanent agricultural stability. No child in the capital ever went to sleep with an empty stomach again. Years passed with a steady, comforting rhythm. The harsh northern winters remained brutal, but the kingdom was finally prepared to endure them. Chloe grew stronger and taller with each passing season. Blynn remained the fiercely loyal shadow of the growing princess at all times. The scarred female knight taught Chloe how to ride horses and throw a lightweight dagger. Chris spent countless hours teaching her the complex arts of diplomacy. He showed her how to read the hidden intentions of visiting ambassadors. He never once tried to mold her into a ruthless conqueror. He simply wanted her mind to be as sharp as the finest steel. 10 years drifted by like a fleeting, peaceful dream. The massive stone fortress was virtually unrecognizable from its former gloomy state. It was the eve of the great winter solstice festival. Servants bustled happily through the wide, brightly lit corridors. They carried massive pine branches and fragrant wreaths to decorate the castle walls. Laughter echoed freely from the bustling royal kitchens below. Chris stood quietly in the center of the vast royal library. He wore a fine, dark tunic embroidered with silver thread along the collar. Silver strands now lightly dusted his dark hair, marking the rapid passage of time. His heavily scarred face had softened considerably over the past decade. He turned his head as the heavy iron doors swung open. Chloe stepped into the warm room. She was now a confident, remarkably poised young woman of 17. She wore an elegant dress of deep sapphire velvet. A delicate silver circlet rested upon her carefully braided hair. She carried a small, familiar object in her right hand. "You look incredibly serious today." Chloe smiled warmly as she walked toward her adoptive father. Chris offered a rare, genuine chuckle. "I was simply thinking about how much I despise formal banquets." He crossed his thick arms over his broad chest. Too many lords talking loudly about absolutely nothing. Chloe laughed brightly, the sound filling the quiet library space. "You only have to endure it for a few hours." She stepped closer and placed the object on the wooden table between them. It was the wooden hound, Barnaby. The toy was completely smooth now, worn down by years of constant handling. Chris looked at the small carving with a profound sense of nostalgia. "You still carry that old thing?" Chloe nodded and traced the wooden ears gently. "He has always been a very good protector." She looked up to meet his dark eyes. "But he had an excellent teacher." Chris felt a familiar, tight warmth bloom rapidly in his chest. He stepped forward and placed his large hand on her shoulder. "You do not need protectors anymore, Chloe." He spoke the words with immense, quiet pride. "You are the strongest person in this entire keep." Chloe leaned her head against his hand for a brief moment. "It is almost time for the opening feast." She stepped back and offered him her arm. "Are you ready to face the court?" Chris sighed heavily in mock defeat. "Lead the way." They walked out of the library and down the brightly lit corridor together. Guards snapped to attention as they passed, their faces reflecting deep admiration. They reached the massive oak doors of the great hall shortly after. 10 years ago, this room had been a freezing cavern of absolute terror. Chris had sat upon his iron throne in suffocating, deadly silence. The heavy doors swung open to reveal a completely transformed space. Hundreds of thick candles cast a brilliant, warm glow across the room. Long wooden tables were covered in roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet pastries. The assembled nobility and local guild leaders were already laughing and sharing wine. A lively band of musicians played a cheerful tune in the corner. The music stopped immediately when the herald struck his staff against the floor. "Presenting His Majesty, King Chris, and Her Royal Highness, Princess Chloe." The entire hall erupted into deafening, enthusiastic applause. It was not the forced clapping of terrified hostages. It was the genuine celebration of a beloved ruler and his rightful heir. Chris guided Chloe down the stone steps toward the main table. He did not sit upon the elevated iron throne anymore. He had ordered the cold, imposing chair dismantled 5 years ago. They sat together at the center of the head table on the main floor. Bryn stood vigilantly just a few paces behind them, though her stance was relaxed. The feast commenced with a joyous, overwhelming energy. Chris watched his daughter converse easily with a visiting foreign dignitary. She handled the political small talk with incredible grace and sharp wit. He reached into his pocket and brushed his fingers against a small wooden box. Inside the box rested a tiny, petrified crumb of stale bread. He had preserved a fragment of her original offering all those years ago. It served as a constant anchor whenever his dark thoughts threatened to return. The feast lasted well into the late evening. The air grew thick with the smell of roasted pine and sweet cinnamon. Chloe eventually stood up and gently tapped her silver goblet with a spoon. The ringing sound quickly silenced the massive, crowded room. Every eye in the great hall turned toward the young princess. She raised her cup and looked out over the sea of smiling faces. "We gather tonight to celebrate the return of the sun." Her voice was clear and strong, carrying effortlessly to the back walls. "We celebrate the warmth that sustains us through the longest, darkest nights." She turned slightly to look directly at Chris. 10 years ago, I walked into this hall seeking nothing more than a warm fire. A profound silence settled over the attentive crowd. I was a child lost in a terrible winter. She smiled, and tears gathered faintly in the corners of her eyes. I found much more than a fire. Chloe raised her silver goblet a fraction higher. I found a father who taught me that true strength lies in protecting others. The nobles watched the powerful exchange with deep reverence. He built a kingdom where no one has to freeze in the shadows. She turned her gaze back to the gathered assembly. To the king. The entire hall surged to its feet in perfect unison. To the king! The booming toast shook the heavy rafters of the ancient stone keep. Chris felt an overwhelming rush of pure, unadulterated emotion. He stood up slowly and raised his own goblet in acknowledgement. He looked at the remarkable young woman standing proudly by his side. She had walked into his desolate life and completely rewritten his destiny. He'd conquered armies and crushed rebellions with absolute malice. Yet his greatest legacy would always be the kindness he learned from a starving child. The musicians immediately struck up another lively, energetic tune. The hall quickly descended back into joyous celebration and laughter. Chris placed his goblet down on the heavy wooden table. He pulled the small wooden box from his pocket and set it beside his plate. He did not need to carry the petrified bread to remember his humanity anymore. His salvation was standing right next to him, laughing freely in the warm light. The Alpha King finally allowed himself to fully enjoy the peace he had built.
This story is such a beautiful reminder that the smallest act of kindness can truly melt the coldest of hearts. If Chris and Chloe's journey touched yours today, please gently tap that subscribe button. And I'd absolutely love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below and tell me how this ending made you feel. Hank you for being here, and see you next time.